The night my daughter came back into my life, she was on her knees in the lobby of the building I built, scrubbing 3-year-old gum off marble I'd imported from a quarry outside Carrara. And she didn't look up when I walked past her the first time. I want you to understand something before I tell you what happened. I am Richard Ashford. I'm 61 years old. My name is on 40 floors of glass and steel in Lower Manhattan, on a stock ticker, on the side of buildings in Singapore and Frankfurt and Sao Paulo. Forbes put my net worth at $3 billion 2 years ago, and I remember reading that number in an airport lounge in Zurich and feeling absolutely nothing because the only number that ever mattered to me was 7. That was my daughter's age, the last time I held her hand and knew for certain that she still loved me. Her name is Lily Catherine Ashford, named after her mother, who I lost 17 years ago on a wet road outside Poughkeepsie in a car I was driving on a night I still can't talk about without my hands going cold. I need to go back because you won't understand what it meant to see her on that floor unless you understand everything that came before it. Catherine and I met in a business law seminar at Columbia when I was 26 and broke and running a failing logistics startup out of a rented office above a dry cleaner in Queens. She was finishing her degree. She had this laugh that made strangers turn around in restaurants, and she believed in me back when believing in me required a serious act of faith, because I had exactly one client and a business plan held together with hope and bank overdrafts. We married 18 months later in her parents' backyard in Ohio, and Lily was born 3 years after that, in a hospital room where I cried so hard the nurse asked if I needed a chair. The company started turning around when Lily was 4. By the time she was 6, we had our first $100 million contract, a logistics deal with a shipping conglomerate that changed everything. I was gone more than I was home. I told myself that was temporary. I told myself once we hit this milestone, once we closed this round, once we got past this quarter, I'd slow down. Catherine never once complained to my face. She just got quieter every year in a way I mistook for patience instead of what it actually was, which was exhaustion. The night we lost her, I was driving us home from a fundraiser in the Hudson Valley. It was raining the way it rains in late October, sideways, relentless, headlights turning to smears on the windshield. Lily was asleep in the back seat in a booster seat, 7 years old, wearing a dress Catherine had bought her for the event, dark green with a velvet collar. Catherine was telling me, gently, that I'd missed Lily's school recital that week for a board call I could have taken from the car. I remember getting defensive. I remember looking at her instead of the road for maybe a second and a half. That's all it took. A truck jackknifed coming the opposite direction, and by the time I corrected, we'd already crossed the center line. I walked away with a broken collarbone and cuts that healed in 6 weeks. Catherine didn't walk away at all. Lily, in the back seat, was untouched. Physically untouched. The doctors called it a miracle. I never once, in 17 years, called it that. Margaret, Catherine's mother, arrived from Ohio 3 days after the funeral, and she did not look at me the same way again for the rest of her life. I don't blame her for that now. I understand grief does things to people that logic can't undo, but at the time, drowning in my own guilt, unable to sleep in a house that still smelled like Catherine's perfume, I made a decision I have spent every year since regretting in a slightly different way. I asked Margaret to take Lily to Ohio. Temporarily, I told myself, just until I could function, just until the company, which was in the middle of a hostile takeover attempt from a competitor circling us like it could smell the blood in the water, was stable enough that I wasn't working 18-hour days, 7 days a week. I told Margaret it would be a few months. She said, in a voice with no warmth left in it at all, "Take whatever time you need, Richard. She'll be safe here." A few months became a year. The takeover attempt turned into 2 more years of restructuring, expansion, a public offering that nearly collapsed twice before it succeeded. I flew to Ohio when I could. The first year, I made it out 6 times. The second year, 4 times. Every visit, Lily was a little more distant, a little more careful with me, like she was meeting a nice stranger who happened to share her last name. I told myself this was temporary too. I told myself once, things stabilized at the company, I'd bring her home, or I'd move to be near her, or something, some version of a plan that kept sliding further into a future I never actually arrived at. What I didn't know, what I wouldn't learn until decades later, standing frozen in my own lobby at 11. At 11:40 on a Tuesday morning, Was that the version of me who kept saying temporary had already spent 17 years building a life that had no room for her in it, brick by brick, meeting by meeting, until the walls were so high I couldn't have found the door even if I'd wanted to? The elevator doors had opened onto the lobby the way they did every day, a soft chime, a rush of recycled air smelling faintly of lemon polish, and fresh-cut flowers from the arrangement the front desk replaced every Monday. I had my phone in one hand, scrolling through an email about a supplier contract in Guangzhou, half my brain already 3,000 miles away negotiating steel tariffs, the other half thinking about whether I had time to grab a coffee before the 10 o'clock. That's the thing nobody tells you about the moments that split your life in half. They don't announce themselves. They don't slow down to let you prepare. They just arrive in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday, dressed as nothing at all, and by the time you understand what's happening, you're already changed. She had her back to me at first. That's important, because if she'd been facing me, I think I would have turned around, gotten back in the elevator, and pretended I'd forgotten something in my office. But she was bent slightly at the waist, working a long-handled mop in slow, even strokes across a stretch of marble near the security desk, and something about the set of her shoulders made me stop walking. Not stop and think about stopping, just stop, the way your body does sometimes before your mind catches up, like it already knows something your conscious thoughts haven't processed yet. I told myself it was nothing. Lobbies are full of people. Cleaning crews rotate in and out of a building like ours every single day, dozens of them. Faces I'd never bothered to memorize, because why would I? They weren't the ones sitting across from me negotiating 9-figure deals. They weren't the ones I needed to remember. I had walked past cleaning staff 1,000 times in 17 years without a second glance. The way you walk past furniture, the way the human eye is trained to filter out what it decides isn't relevant to the task at hand. But then she turned to reach for the yellow caution sign folded against her cart, and I saw her face in profile, and every excuse I had ready collapsed at once. It was the eyes. Everyone always says that it's the eyes that give someone away after years apart, and I always thought that was just something people said in movies to make a scene feel more poetic than real life actually is. But it's true. It's true in a way that knocked the air clean out of my chest. She had her mother's eyes, the same wide-set, slightly downturned shape that used to make Diane look permanently thoughtful even when she was laughing. But the color was mine. That strange hazel green that turns almost gold under fluorescent light. The color I used to see in the mirror, every morning shaving and never think twice about. Because why would you notice your own eyes? They're just there. They're just yours. Her hair was different, darker than I remembered, pulled back into a low, practical ponytail that had slipped loose in places from a full morning of work, strands sticking to her forehead, from the heat that always builds up near the loading dock doors. She was taller than the last time I truly looked at her, though of course she would be. 17 years does that. 17 years takes an 11-year-old girl and turns her into a grown woman with her own gait, her own way of standing, her own private history I knew absolutely nothing about. She had a small tattoo on the inside of her left wrist, something delicate, maybe a bird. I couldn't tell from that distance, and it hit me like a physical blow that I didn't know when she'd gotten it, or why, or whether it meant anything, or whether she'd been scared getting it, or whether someone had held her hand while the needle went in. I didn't know anything. That was the thing that froze me in place harder than the shock of recognition itself. It wasn't just that I hadn't seen my daughter in years, it was that I had absolutely no map of the years I'd missed. No landmarks, no timeline. Somewhere between the last stiff, formal phone call and this exact moment, an entire human life had happened to her, unfolding scene by scene, while I was in boardrooms and airport lounges and steakhouse dinners with men whose names I could recite instantly, but whose faces meant less to me than my own child's did in that lobby, and I hadn't witnessed a single frame of it. My phone buzzed against my palm. I didn't look down. For the first time in longer than I could remember, an email felt like it was happening on a different planet, in a different life, to a different man who had different priorities than the one currently standing rooted to polished marble, unable to make his legs move in either direction, because that was the other thing happening inside me. Underneath the shock, underneath the flood of questions, I had no way to answer. There was a war going on between two very simple impulses, and neither one of them would yield. Part of me wanted to walk straight toward her, drop every ounce of composure I'd spent decades constructing, and just say her name out loud in the middle of that lobby. Consequences be damned. Security guards and executives and morning meetings be damned. Say it the way I used to say it, when she was small enough to run down the hallway and launch herself into my arms before I'd even gotten my coat off. Just her name. Nothing else needed. Just confirmation that I'd seen her, that I knew her, that after everything, I still recognized my own child. And the other part of me, the part that had been running the show for 17 years, the part that had built an empire out of knowing exactly when to retreat and regroup, was already calculating the exits. The elevator was 11 steps behind me. I could turn, swipe my badge, be back on the executive floor before she even noticed I'd been standing there. I could sit down at my desk, close the door, and tell myself I'd imagined the resemblance, that it was a trick of fluorescent lighting and guilt, working together to manufacture ghosts out of strangers. I could go back to the version of my life where this hadn't happened yet, where the last 17 years were still a closed book I didn't have to open, where I could keep telling myself, someday, without ever having to specify when someday actually arrived. I hated that part of me. I hated it with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. Standing there watching it try to win, watching it dress cowardice up as practicality, watching it whisper that this wasn't the right time, there was never going to be a right time, there had never once in 17 years been a right time. That was the whole rotten truth of it, and some buried, honest piece of me finally admitted that out loud, silently, standing in my own lobby like a stranger in my own life. She hadn't looked up yet. She was crouched now, wringing out the mop head into the yellow bucket, her forearms tensed with the motion, and I watched her do something so small and so devastating I almost lost my footing entirely. She hummed, just under her breath, barely audible over the ambient hum of the building's ventilation system, a few notes of something I didn't recognize, some tune that belonged entirely to a life I had no part in. It struck me that she had probably hummed 1,000 different songs over the years, in 1,000 different rooms I'd never been in, comforting herself through boredom or exhaustion or grief, and I had missed every single one of them. I had missed the entire soundtrack of her becoming a person, a security guard near the turnstiles, a heavy-set man named Rennie, who'd worked the morning shift for as long as I could remember, called out something to her, easy and familiar, the kind of casual banter that told me instantly they knew each other, that this wasn't her first week, that she had been in this building, my building, close enough to touch, for some unknown stretch of time that I hadn't noticed. She laughed at whatever he said, a real laugh, quick and warm, and the sound of it detonated something in my chest because I recognized it. Older, rougher at the edges, but unmistakably the same laugh she'd had as a little girl chasing our old golden retriever around the backyard sprinkler. The same laugh I hadn't heard directed at anything I'd said or done in longer than I wanted to admit. How long had she worked here? That question alone was enough to make my knees feel unreliable. Was it weeks, months, longer? Had she walked past the elevator bank I used every single day, dozens of times, while I was upstairs approving budgets and reviewing quarterly earnings, completely unaware that the daughter I kept promising myself I'd reconnect with someday was pushing a cart across the very lobby my name was carved, engraved into, in brass, above the front entrance, visible from the street? The absurdity of it nearly buckled me. 17 years of excuses about distance, about timing, about the impossibility of fitting her into a schedule that never had room, and here she was, closer to me physically than she had been in nearly 2 decades, and I hadn't known. The universe, or fate, or whatever cruel architect designs these things, had apparently decided that if I wasn't going to go looking for her, it would simply place her directly in my path and watch what I did with it. I thought about Diane in that instant, too. Unbidden, a flash of her face the last time we'd spoken, years after the divorce had gone from bitter to merely distant, her voice flat with an exhaustion that had nothing to do with anger anymore and everything to do with having given up expecting anything different from me. She'd said something once, near the very end of whatever civility we still owed each other, that I had buried deep enough I thought I'd forgotten it. She said, "You're not a bad man. You're just a man who thinks there's always more time." I had waved it off then, defensive, already halfway out the door to catch a flight. Standing in that lobby, watching my daughter wring out a mop with hands that had learned to do that job without my ever teaching her anything at all, I finally understood exactly what she meant and exactly how wrong I'd been to dismiss it. My legs still hadn't decided anything. I became aware, distantly, of the receptionist at the front desk, glancing over at me, her expression flickering with the particular confusion reserved for seeing your boss standing motionless in the middle of a lobby for no apparent reason. I forced my face into something neutral, something that could pass for a man checking a message on his phone, though my thumb hadn't moved across the screen in over a minute. I was aware, too, of how strange I must have looked to anyone watching, this tailored, silver-haired man in a charcoal suit worth more than some of these employees made in a month, frozen 10 feet from a floor cleaner, as though she were a ghost risen up out of the marble itself. In a way, she was exactly that. A ghost of every version of fatherhood I'd promised myself I'd eventually get around to. A ghost of every birthday I'd sent a card for instead of showing up. Every school play I'd told myself I'd catch the recording of and never had. Every summer that slipped by with a phone call standing in for a plane ticket. I kept meaning to buy. She was the accumulated weight of every small betrayal I'd told myself didn't count, because it was only temporary, only this once, only until things settled down at the company. Things had never settled down. I understood that now with a brutal, late clarity. Things were never going to settle down, because I had built my entire life around a structure that required constant motion, constant crisis, constant demand, precisely because, as long as there was always something urgent pulling at me, I never had to sit still long enough to reckon with what I'd left behind. She straightened up then, pushing a loose strand of hair back from her face. She straightened up then, pushing a loose strand of hair back from her face, with the back of her wrist, the way you do when your hands are still damp from a spray bottle, and you don't want to leave a streak on your own skin. It was such a small, ordinary gesture. Millions of people make it every day without anyone noticing. But I noticed, because I had seen that exact motion before, 20 years earlier, on a girl standing on a kitchen stool, trying to reach the top shelf where her mother kept the good cereal, wrist tilted back the same way, same tilt of the chin. Genetics is a strange kind of theft. It steals moments from you and hands them back when you least expect it. Dressed in a stranger's clothes, I was standing maybe 40 feet from her, half hidden behind one of the marble columns that framed the entrance to the executive elevator bank, and I remember thinking, absurdly, that 40 feet was both the closest and the farthest I had been from my daughter in as long as I could calculate without doing actual math in my head, which tells you something about how long it had actually been. Close enough to see the small gold hoop in her left ear. Far enough that if I turned around right now and walked back through those revolving doors, she would never know I had been there at all. That was the moment a woman's voice cut across the lobby, sharp and businesslike, carrying easily over the low hum of the ventilation system and the click of heels on stone. "Madison, you're on 3 next, not 4. Facilities says 4's already been done this morning." I felt my stomach drop through the floor. Madison. I hadn't heard that name spoken out loud in so long that for one disorienting second it didn't even register as a name at all, just a sound, syllables without weight, and then it landed, all at once, like a door slamming somewhere deep in my chest, and every excuse I had built for myself over the better part of 2 decades collapsed under the simple, undeniable fact that a woman standing in a hallway I owned had just confirmed, without knowing she was confirming anything, that the girl pushing a cleaning cart across my lobby floor was my daughter, not a woman who looked like her. Not a coincidence, not a trick of lighting or wishful thinking dressed up as memory. Madison, my Madison. Grown into a stranger I didn't recognize until she moved, and yet unmistakably, irreversibly her. I looked at the woman who had called out to her. Mid-40s, gray polo shirt with a small embroidered logo I recognized as belonging to Halbrook Facilities Group, the third-party contractor we used for janitorial services across 4 buildings, including this one, my headquarters, the one with cord, "My name is Unudi Cranit," above the entrance, in letters 18 inches tall. She had a clipboard tucked under one arm and a walkie-talkie clipped to her hip, and she said Madison's name the way any supervisor says an employee's name, without ceremony, without weight, a simple correction about which floor needed attention. She had no idea what those 2 syllables had just done to the man standing by the elevators. I watched Madison's shoulders. That's the thing about paralysis. When your body refuses to move, your eyes start doing all the work your legs won't do, and mine locked onto her shoulders because I remembered, with a clarity that startled me, that she used to hunch them slightly whenever she was uncomfortable, some old childhood habit her mother used to gently correct. A hand pressed flat between her shoulder blades, saying, "Stand up straight, sweetheart, you'll thank me when you're 40. I watched to see if the habit still lived in her. It did. For just a half second, her shoulders curled inward, that same defensive posture, before she caught herself and pulled them back level again, the way you'd straighten a picture frame that had gone crooked. "Copy that," she said to her supervisor, her voice carrying just far enough for me to hear it. Steady, flat, professional, nothing in it that suggested the ground had also just shifted under her feet, though I would come to understand, in the minutes that followed, that it absolutely had. Because here is what I saw next, and it is the detail that has not left me since, the detail that replays behind my eyes at 3 in the morning, more reliably than any alarm clock ever could. She did not look surprised. If she had truly not known who I was, if this had been the first moment she'd laid eyes on me, if I had simply been some anonymous man in an expensive suit loitering near the elevators of a building she cleaned twice a week, there would have been nothing on her face at all. Strangers don't perform reactions for other strangers. They glance and move on. But Madison's eyes had already found mine before her supervisor ever called her name. I understood that now, replaying the sequence in my head with the sick clarity of hindsight. She had seen me first. Before I saw her, she had clocked me the second I stepped off that elevator, had probably watched me for a full 10 or 15 seconds while I was still fumbling with my phone, and hadn't yet looked up. And in that window of time, before I ever registered her existence, she had already made a decision. She had decided to say nothing. That's the part that split me open, standing right there in my own lobby, in front of a marble column, with my company's name laser-etched into a plaque 6 feet away. It would have been one thing, a painful thing, but a survivable thing, if she genuinely hadn't recognized me, if 20 years and gray at my temples and 40 extra pounds around my middle had erased me from her memory the way distance and time are supposed to blur a person's features until they're unrecognizable. That version of this moment would have hurt in a simple, clean way. A father lost to time, unknown to his own child. Tragic, but at least honest in its tragedy. But this was worse, because it meant she knew exactly who I was, and she had looked at the man who was supposed to be her father, and something in her had calculated, in the space of a heartbeat, that the safest and simplest response was to look away and keep working. Not shock, not anger, not even the confrontation I might have almost welcomed at that point. Something to release the pressure that had been building in my chest since the elevator doors opened. Just quiet, practiced avoidance. The kind of avoidance you only get good at after years of not being seen, or after years of choosing not to be seen by someone specific. She had learned, somewhere along the way, how to disappear in plain sight from me. I thought about how long that takes to master. You don't wake up one day with that skill. You build it, deliberately or not, out of necessity, the same way I had built my entire schedule, out of urgency and crisis, so I'd never have to sit still with what I'd left behind. We had both, it turned out, constructed elaborate architectures to avoid the exact same reckoning. Mine was made of quarterly earnings calls, and emergency board meetings, and flights to Singapore that could have waited another week. Hers, apparently, was made of something quieter. The discipline to keep her eyes on a cart handle, to keep her wrist moving in slow, even circles as she wiped down the brass push plate on a set of doors that led to a boardroom she had probably never once been invited into. My phone buzzed against my hip. I didn't look at it. That alone should tell you how far outside of myself I had traveled in the last 90 seconds, because for as long as I could remember, my phone buzzing was a Pavlovian trigger, an instant redirection of every ounce of my attention, no matter what.